So finally, of the three categories of trees and shrubs, we have the trees and the tree-like shrubs. These are plants that have a stiff, which is to say a woody branch structure that divides many times. And these are a higher class of plant. We kind of know that a witch hazel beats a forsythia, and the reason is that articulate branch structure makes them more attractive. And I call them tree-like shrubs not because they're big or have a single trunk, but because they have that articulate branch structure. Examples around here would be rhododendrons, camellias, all the trees, witch hazels, double file viburnums. And they have a much smaller pruning budget, which means you can't do as much pruning and you need to use smaller cuts and mainly thinning cuts. I want you to avoid size reduction on all the trees except fruit trees and hedges. But size reduction doesn't usually work on a tree. It might work a little bit on a tree-like shrub, but moderately, always using the reduction cut. Most often we get what we want from our trees and tree-like shrubs by taking off the lower limbs to get it up off the shrub that's underneath it, or so you can walk by it, and also by thinning it out altogether using many smaller thinning cuts. This is a thinned out camellia. There's nothing wrong with a full-bodied camellia, one dressed to the ground and really thick. They can be pretty cool. You have a great big one of those in your backyard and it blooms and you're happy. And in fact, shrubs don't need to be pruned to do their best work. When gardeners want to describe a really good pruning situation, they say it had never been touched. So don't feel that you need to prune. If your shrub looks good to you, just take off a couple of lower limbs, maybe do some deadwooding, leave it alone and take all the credit. But maybe you have a camellia right outside your window and it's really bugging you. You feel like a giant green hippopotamus is sitting outside your front door. Well, there's things you can do to make it look better to you. One is to take off lower limbs like this so it looks a little bit like a tree, and then you thin it gently throughout so it allows a little light to show through and you can kind of see into it, sort of like lace. Here's the landscape that we worked on with the grounds crew of a school district. We have a cane grower, a tree-like, and a mound. The mound is on the left, and that's euonymus. There wasn't much we could do with that except take off the lower limbs and rake out the cigarette butts and pop cans. The one on the right is a cane grower, and it had been sheared into the shape of, say, a freezer, perhaps. And we didn't like it and it looked too horrible, so we just cut it to the ground, or actually to a low framework, and raked out all the dead leaves so people knew that we didn't hate it. And then we spent about 45 minutes thinning out the tree-like, which is the Japanese lace leaf maple behind it. And this is it after it has been done. And it has this beautiful weeping branch structure. Mainly all we did was take out dead leaves and deadwood. And in fact, 90% of all the cuts I've ever made on any plant are deadwood cuts. Cannot be emphasized too much. When I talk to grounds crews, we have renovation workshops, they say, I didn't realize what a big difference the deadwooding would make. We also take out Mr. Wrongway, some of the crossing rubbing, and some of the ones that head too far down outside their lair. We'll talk more about that soon. Major deadwooding. Remember to deadwood. Do it first and do it always. It doesn't count against the pruning budget, and it always makes things look better. And here's an illustration of the sorts of cuts that you might use on a tree or a tree-like shrub. On the bottom you see true suckers. These are the straight up shoots that come up off of the rootstock or the trunk. And unlike water sprouts, you need to take them all off and you need to take them all off every year. I'm sorry, there's no magic cure for suckers. Then you're also going to find that one that touches the ground or hangs too far down. Then you're going to look for Mr. Wrong Way. He starts on one side of the plant and heads back through the center out the other side. Then you're looking for a few of the worst crossing rubbing branches, and you take one off and leave the better placed one, usually headed out from the center, but not always. If to do so does not exceed the pruning budget. And the pruning budget for trees and tree-like shrubs, much smaller. You want to resist size reduction, and you only want to take off, say, 1/8 to 1/16 of the foliage. And then you're going to look for parallel branches. You can see a picture of that down at the bottom at the right. If you have two branches that are close together and are parallel, it looks better to take off one, usually the lower one. If you have three, you take out the center one. The trick to thinning is every space is filled, but with less stuff. You don't strip stuff out to the ends. You take some and leave some, and take some and leave some, so that it is equally lacy the entire way through. And you should know that there aren't like the right branches. You're working from the bottom up and the inside out, going in a roughly spiral fashion and judging each section. And every once in a while you get paralyzed with indecision. You have kind of a little argument in your head. You're saying things like, well, is that too big for me to take out? Will that cause water sprouts? Will that leave a great big hole? Well, when you come to that point, just move on. You can't finish a section, because if you do that all the way through, you will have over pruned. So you just, here again, want to take out a few of the worst, the ones you're pretty sure need to go, and keep moving. You get out pretty frequently and kind of blur your eyes and look at the plant and ask yourself where you should concentrate next. And know that you can't make them perfect. You can only make them better. I think of pruning more and more like I think of my marriage. More precisely, my husband. Which is to say, if there's something that's really bothering you, and it's a small thing, you may be able to correct it with some gentle pruning. But you will not change the intrinsic nature of your shrub by heavy-handed pruning. It will only cause it to rebel. And the secret to a happy life is to accept your shrub for the good things it does, and maybe ignore some of those imperfections. So we've talked about taking out the suckers, the one that touches the ground, Mr. Wrong Way, also the branches that head into the next plant, and then shrubs kind of, and trees arrange themselves into layers. There's a main trunk, and then there'll be sort of a layer here of scaffold branches, and then below that, over to one side, there will be another layer. And if something from one layer passes down into the layer below, or goes from a lower layer into the one above, it may look better to prune that off, if to do so does not exceed the pruning budget. And then your very last thing on shrubs only is size reduction. You don't want to do too much of that, or your plant looks weird, or you get water sprouts. I also want to tell you that you start at the bottom and you do the back side, the side that is up against the house first, and a lot of problems just sort of seem to magically disappear. Nothing about pruning is intuitive. It's all quite mysterious and counterintuitive, and you can't wait for the light bulb to go on to start pruning. You just have to follow the directions and be brave and start doing it and observe the effects. This would be the side branch of a shrub which takes heavy thinning, and the dotted line stands for the deadwood. First we take out the deadwood, and now on the upper left-hand corner is what we have after we've taken out the deadwood. My illustrator has blacked out the next chosen branch to be removed so that we can see it. And we're going to take this rather big branch out in order to open up the center, which always pretty much makes things look better. And then the picture below it is how it looks afterwards. And then the picture on the upper right side is the series of smaller branches that we're going to take out. And the bottom picture on the right is the finished product. And you should know that this is heavy thinning. This is not light thinning, this is heavy thinning. This is the only time I've ever caught thinning on tape, on film. It doesn't usually show up in books, in illustrations, or on camera because it's so three-dimensional you can really only do a simplified diagram. But here's 3 guys in the weeping willow tree, 1, 2, 3. And this is the before picture, and this is the after picture. And there's a guy standing way out on a branch. He's going to finish thinning out that branch so that it matches the rest of it. I'll go back. Oops. That's the before. Dirty, messy. After. It looks like a beautiful beaded curtain. And in fact, my mentor Andrea said a sentence that changed how I saw the world. She said, "A shrub should look as good in the winter as it does in the summer." Before that, deciduous things just sort of disappeared for me, but now we look at the branch structure of trees and shrubs to see how they look in the winter and if they're up to snuff. Speaking of trees, I can't go into them a lot, but the most important thing you can learn, besides to thin them and don't top them, is to make a collar cut. People usually prune their limb too far out or too close. We don't want to make a stub cut. We don't want to make a flush cut. We want to make a good collar cut. At the base of every branch, you will find a collar. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it isn't, but it looks like the collar, you know, like a sweater collar. And you don't want to cut too far out or you will leave a stub. It'll die back to the collar the next year and that collar will plump up. You don't want to cut flush to the trunk because that cuts off the collar, and the collar is actually wood that belongs to the trunk. It doesn't belong to the limb. And why do we care? Is because you don't want to cause your tree to rot out. That's how they die. And so you want to take off a limb, and the tree can actually compartmentalize that wound that comes from losing a limb rather easily if the limb is not too big. But when you bash the trunk or cut into the collar, you open up the trunk to rot, and that's not a good thing. So spend some time learning where the collar is and cut just to it. Here's the same sort of illustration. We have a stub cut on the left, a proper collar cut in the middle, and a flush cut on the right. And the stub cut allows a lot of rot into the heart of the tree. The collar cut just takes a little bit of rot inside the tree, and the flush cut sends rot going up and down your trunk. Here's the actual inside of a tree showing the limb disappear into the tree. The limb is not physically attached to the trunk. It is laminated in place. This is kind of a hard concept for people to get. You want to take off a large limb in stages. You want to take the weight off first with cuts 1 and 2, and then the third cut is made outside the collar. Sometimes you have to cut from the bottom up, which is kind of awkward, in order not to inadvertently cut into your collar. Spend a lot of time positioning yourself correctly to get the correct cut. Here's an illustration of the different sorts of pruning you can do with trees. One is thinning, and the part on the right is how it looks after it's thinned. Skirting means to take off, or limbing up, or crown raising are all synonyms for taking off lower limbs. And if they're not too big, you can thin up or limb up about 1/3 of the height of the tree. And the third is windowing, and that's when you take out whole limbs back to the trunk. If it's close to the window, you might be able to get a view through by interlimbing or windowing. But in any case, you should not be pruning your big trees. It's way dangerous. You need to hire an ISA certified arborist. And you can go on their website. ISA stands for International Society of Arboriculture. And they give them a big long test to make sure they really do know something about pruning. There are a lot of well-meaning, hard-working people out there who will come butcher your tree and be offended that you don't like it. So it pays to look for the ISA certified arborist. They will have a white card in their wallet, and they're just dying for somebody to ask them for it. They will be very proud. And then you want them to bid to ANSI A300 pruning standards, and they should know what those A300s are. We call them the A300s. You can order a copy of them from Plant Amnesty if you need to, but you don't really need to know what they are. You just need to have the arborist know what they are. Anybody can call themselves an arborist, just like anybody can call themselves a landscaper.